Good morning, y'all. It's good to be back here this morning. Hope all of you have had a great holiday. It's been a little bit of a busy week, I know, for some. We've started a new year, and new years are always exciting, and I hope that 2021 is off to a great start for you. We're excited about this year and the possibilities it brings for us as a congregation, and you're going to be hearing more about our approach to 2021 in our other services as we continue on in the next few weeks. But we're glad you're here with us for Bible class this morning. This morning is also an exciting opportunity an exciting moment in our Bible class. You know, over the last few weeks, we've spent a lot of time laying the foundation for the book of Hebrews. We began 4 weeks ago by looking at those background ideas and looking at Hebrews as a book. We discussed the question of who wrote it. We looked at how it was probably written to the church at Rome and saw that it was likely written somewhere between 60 and 65 AD. We also noted that it was written as a sermon to encourage the church there. From there, we turned our attention over the last 3 weeks to several core concepts that are necessary, I think, to establish the context of the book of Hebrews: priesthood, atonement, sacrifice, covenant, and law. All of these ideas are deeply rooted in the Old Covenant and the law of Moses. I know for some of you this may have seemed a bit long or tedious, but I hope that these 4 weeks of review and background will be helpful for our study as we move through the book of Hebrews. I know it seems strange that we started a class on Hebrews and have yet to crack open the book to get into the text, but I really do believe that these things we've been looking at will help us as we go along. Yet, nevertheless, today, at long last, we finally reached our text here in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. These 4 short verses are a powerful introduction and beginning to the book of Hebrews, and they go something like this. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature, and He upholds the universe by the word of His power. After making purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name He has inherited is more excellent than theirs. These 4 verses are a significant and packed, loaded introduction. In our English translations, these verses have been divided into several sentences. But Hebrews 1 through 4, is actually one long, beautifully constructed sentence. It's also fundamentally the announcement that God has spoken completely and finally through His Son. The basic sentence in the text here in Hebrews 1 through 4 is that God has spoken through His Son, whose name is superior to the angels. Everything else that's in this sentence is affirming is serving this theological affirmation. It is serving this core message that God has spoken through Jesus, and Jesus is greater than all others. With this powerful announcement about the revelation of God and the identity of the Son, the author of Hebrews will launch into his rich and deep message of encouragement on the basis of the supremacy of Christ. And so these 4 verses that we're going to look at today really are an incredibly important foundation for us to keep in mind as we move through the book of Hebrews. And so, as Hebrews opens, the preacher, whoever the author was, draws a series of contrasts that are designed to frame this revelation or communication from God. He first contrasts the era of the revelation. He says, on the one hand, it was in the past. The former revelation was in the past, but this current one is in these last days. Then, after contrasting the era, he contrasts the recipients. He says the first revelation was to our forefathers, while this one is to us. Then we see that he contrasts the agent through whom that revelation, that message came. He says in the past, in the message that was to our forefathers, that was delivered through the prophets. But this new revelation has come by his Son. Then he contrasts the way that it happens. He says on one hand it occurred in various ways in the past, but this time it occurs in one way, by the Son. This isn't explicit, it's an implied idea here. But in contrast to the various ways he did it in times past, this time the revelation through the Son has come one way. And then he finally contrasts how the frequency that this occurred. He says in the past it occurred at various times. God didn't just speak to them on one occasion, he spoke to them on lots of occasions. But in this current one, it came again at one time because it came through the Son. So what we see here is in these first two verses, or really verse and a half, in Hebrews 1 through the first part of verse 2, we see this contrast set up in that long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. In this short phrase, we see all of these contrasts being drawn to the way that God speaks to his people. It's important, though, to note that the author is not necessarily contrasting the current revelation of God with any one particular revelation of God in the past. Rather, he's thinking of the whole continuity of God's revelation of himself from creation up to the present. He's thinking about all of the ways that God ever spoke to his people. It's not just saying, well, at Sinai he did it this way and in Jesus he did it this way. No, this is every time he did it in contrast to this current period. The reality is that in the past God had revealed himself through a lot of different ways. He had revealed himself through dreams, and we've talked about some dreams in which God revealed himself through our study of Genesis. You remember the dreams of Joseph, how God revealed messages to Joseph through dreams. God revealed himself through direct messages. We know all about those when he speaks to Abraham, or when he spoke to Isaac, or Jacob, or when he appears to Moses at the burning bush. He does it through visions. He revealed himself through miracles. And he did it on a lot of different occasions and through a lot of different people. Those people whom God spoke to and who delivered messages from God, we call prophets. But prophets even looked different. Moses was a prophet, but not the kind of prophet we think about most of the time, right? Because when we think prophet, we think Isaiah and Jeremiah, but Moses was a prophet. Noah was a prophet, delivering messages from God. There were the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, some of those other prophets who didn't write books, but who nevertheless were messengers of God. God spoke through a lot of different people on a lot of different occasions in a lot of different ways. And so it's in contrast to all of these, then, that God has in these last days spoken through his Son. Now, in these last days is an important phrase for us to understand. This is merely a way of saying in the final age. There was no longer something coming. As we saw last week in our discussion of the covenant, even during the period of the Mosaic covenant, under the old covenant, God was pointing towards something else. Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and others were pointing toward a coming Messiah. It was never intended, even while it was in existence, to be final. But in these last days, in this final age, the age in which God has revealed himself through the Son, there was no longer something coming. This was the final revelation. This was the final period of God's relationship with his people. This was the long-awaited final revelation and fullness of God, because this revelation, unlike all of the others, was through Jesus. And so that's what we're meaning when we say in these last days. It's in this final period, this final age, and we can say that because it has come through Jesus. Speaking of Jesus, though, the remainder of verse 2 and into verse 3 introduce us more fully to the identity of the Son of God. Here we see 4 key phrases used to describe the Son of God that were familiar to the Jewish audience. And so if we go back to our text, we see that beginning there in the second half of verse 2, we see the Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. These four phrases were all familiar to the Jewish audience. These were phrases that were, during this period in which the book was written, commonly used to describe divine wisdom. But here they are applied directly to the divine Son. And so we see that first, Jesus was the appointed heir of all things. The linkage between name and inheritance is important, because that's what we're going to see there at the end of verse 4. And so in this regard, the Son's name means that he is an heir. Because he is Son, he is heir. The two things are connected. The Son here then, the importance of being the heir in Hebrew theology cannot be overstated. Because here the Son is the heir of the universe, of all things, not just of many nations. Remember, God told Abraham he was going to be the father of many nations. He was going to give his descendants their inheritance. They were going to be heirs according to the promise of Abraham. But Jesus, the Son of God, was not an heir according to the promise of Abraham. He was not just inheriting many nations. He was inheriting the universe. The text here articulates this cosmic status of the Son. Jesus, the Son, is no mere human inheritor or human king or even an angel. He is the royal heir, the appointed heir of the entire universe, of all that is in existence. It is setting up the supremacy of the Son. Next, we see that he was the agent of creation. This shows us the pre-existence of Jesus and drives home that the world was created through him. This is a concept we're familiar with, right? It reaffirms the message of John in John 1:1-3, and the message of Paul in Colossians 1:16. On both of those occasions, we see that Jesus is involved in creation. We see that all things that were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. Jesus was there. He was the creator of the universe. So not only is he the heir of the universe, the appointed heir of all things, he is also the one who created all things. Third, then, we see that that the Son here is described in the first part of verse 3 as the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. The radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. This phrasing is also important because it shows us that the Son is God. It ties us back into the same language used in John 1:14 when we read that the Word became flesh and dwelt among men, full of the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. It connects us back to John 1, where we see that in the beginning is the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It tells us, this text here in Hebrews 1 boldly declares that the Son is the stamped image of God Himself, the exact imprint of His nature. This is telling us something big. This is, the radiance of the glory of God. Yeah, that's kind of weird language for us, or to say it's the exact imprint of His nature. Not necessarily the way we might speak in 2021, but we see that God here is becoming man. That Jesus is more than just a man. That He has the radiance of the glory of God, the radiance that could only be held because He is God. He is the exact imprint of His nature. It's not the same as we being made in God's image, because yes, we are all made in God's image, but folks, I'm not God, and just because I'm made in His image doesn't make me God. But Jesus is the exact imprint of His nature. Jesus is the physical copy of God. He is God Himself. The Son is significant because He is God. Finally, then, we see that the Son sustains the universe by His powerful Word. Jesus was not only involved in creating the world, but His work is ongoing. He is the one who sustains it. And so what we see in this text is that Jesus, the Son, through whom God has revealed Himself, is God in the flesh. It is God within us, Emmanuel, God with us, that He is the Creator of all, the sustainer of all, and the inheritor of all. All of these descriptions here in the second part of verse 2 and the first part of verse 3 serve to show us that the Son shares the identity and reality of God. Folks, we're doing some pretty heavy lifting in these first few verses of Hebrews. And we're not even all the way through them yet. Because as we continue in verse 3, we begin to see why our discussions of priesthood and atonement mattered. Because right off the bat, right here in the very first 3.5 verses, we see that Jesus made purification for sins. You want to know what the audience understood this phrase to mean? Then we got to go back to the understanding the notion of the Day of Atonement and the blood of the covenant. Those things we've been talking about over the last few weeks, because to the audience hearing this message, because remember, they heard it, they did not read it, this was delivered to them, and so when it is read to them that Jesus, after making purification for sins, in their minds that says Jesus became the blood of the covenant that purified us, that atoned for sins in the way that sins had been atoned for through the Day of Atonement. In this we see that the Son atoned for sin. And because he atoned for sin, consequently, his exaltation to the right hand of God was not simply in light of his agency in creation or his cosmic eternal status, but it was also the result of his human act of priestly self-sacrifice for the sake of cleansing his fellow humans from their sins. Jesus will be seated at the right hand of God here in verse 3 because, and as a result of, the atoning self-sacrifice of Jesus offering himself as the sacrificial lamb despite being the priest for the sins of mankind. Jesus became the blood of the covenant. It cannot be overstated, though, that the Son was indeed seated at the right hand of God himself. The enthronement of the Son indeed is the most extensively elaborated theme in Hebrews 1 through 4. The author of Hebrews will link almost everything to this exaltation to the right hand of God. Because Jesus is at the right hand of God, this reflects his status. This ties us back into him being the inheritor of all, the heir of all things, the creator of the universe, the sustainer of the universe, the radiance of the glory of God, the one who made atonement for sins. And so in this regard, the reference to the right hand becomes inclusive of the resurrection, ascension, and enthronement of Jesus. And it is because of this that he continues to function as priest to intercede for his people. Jesus can become the high priest, can intercede the way he does according to Hebrews 8:1, Hebrews 10:12, Hebrews 12:2, all passages we're going to look at more in the next few weeks and months, because he is enthroned and seated at the right hand of God. In this capacity, the Son receives his inheritance, a name that is above every name. It is a better name than the angels. This word better is going to be used 13 times in the book of Hebrews, all of which are designed to show us that Jesus is indeed greater. They're all going to point us back to the supremacy of Christ in every aspect. And with that, we come to the end of verse 4. But before we close this morning, I think it's important for us to think for just a few minutes about how this particular text was intended as a word of encouragement. This is something we're going to try to do as we end our study each week. I think it's important for us that we always keep the purpose of the book in mind as we study. Remember, the book of Hebrews was intended to be a sermon that encouraged its audience. And we need to look at it through that lens. And so the question we're going to try to ask every week as we bring our text to a kind of wrap it all up is, what in this text could be encouraging? How is this text encouraging? Here in these first few verses, I think it might be easy for us to just dismiss it as not being super encouraging, because it's not a long text that we've looked at this morning. I mean, we only looked at 4 verses. And they pretty much just aren't all that exciting. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, so on and so on. But I think to make that assumption would be a mistake on our part. Because there are 2 big things that I think we really need to keep in mind that are indeed very encouraging. The first of those is that God has spoken to us. On 2 occasions in the first 2 verses, we see that God has spoken to man. This is incredibly significant and should encourage us. Because God has spoken to us, we can know who He is. We can know that He is the Lord, Yahweh, the God who spoke the world into existence, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who sent His Son to die for mankind. Because God has spoken to us, we can know what He is like. That He is a God who loves and cares for us. That He is a God of mercy and grace and justice. That He is holy and pure and righteous. We can know what God is like. We can not only know Him, but we can know what He's like. And because God has spoken to us, we can also know what He demands and desires of us as part of our relationship with Him. We don't have to guess. We don't have to try to figure out what it is God wants from us. He's told us. And we can be confident of that because God has spoken to us. We know who He is. We know that He is faithful. We know what He desires. And in doing so, we can be confident in God because He has spoken to us. That is encouraging. And then second, we can also take encouragement from knowing that Jesus is indeed the Son of God, the anointed of God, the creator and sustainer of the universe. This revelation helps us ground our faith. The identity of Jesus is the basis of our faith and the rock upon which our faith is built. These discouraged Roman Christians needed stability and boldness. They needed the kind of theological grounding that can anchor their faith. And so if Jesus is the final and complete revelation of God, as we see that He is in these first 4 verses, then there is no other hope or ground for faith beyond Jesus or exclusive of Jesus. To give up Jesus is to give up God. And so to this group who was struggling, who needed to be reminded of what it was their faith was built on, the book of Hebrews says, let me give you the bedrock again. Let me remind you what our faith is built upon. It is built not upon man, not upon any word, but upon Jesus. It is not built on shallow promises or temples or gods who need to be appeased. It is built upon the Almighty, the God, the Son of God, the anointed Messiah, the one who created and sustains the universe, who is the revelation Himself, the Word incarnate. That is the bedrock of our faith. And that, folks, should be encouraging. And so as we come to the end of these first 4 verses, we see the powerful way the book of Hebrews begins. By being reminded that as we are thinking and struggling in our faith, that we can indeed draw confidence in knowing that our faith is not in vain, because it is built upon the assurance that God has spoken to us, and He's done it through the best means possible, His Son, the exact imprint of the nature of God, God Himself, Word who became flesh, the anointed of God. And folks, that was encouraging news to the people of Rome, and it should be encouraging news for us as well, as we strive each day to bear His image.